A warm welcome to the Centre for Social Development Studies Political Ecology in Asia Dialogue series. My name is Carl Middleton and I'm the Director of CSDS. And today we're very happy to invite Chunchom Sangarasri Gratian to share on her work with us about electricity in Southeast Asia. So please let me first briefly introduce Chunchom. Chom is a co-founder of the energy think tank Palang Thai that has undertaken public interest research for fair, sustainable and democratic development of the energy sector in Thailand, as well as the wider Mekong region. Before founding this organization from 1999 to 2003, Chom was an electricity policy analyst at the Energy Policy and Planning Office with Thailand's Ministry of Energy, where she concentrated on the country's electricity sector reform processes. Over the last 2 decades, Chom has prepared many studies which have been published as reports, as academic articles, and Chom also regularly publishes in the public media as well. Her work has often informed and shaped public debates on electricity policy and planning, as well as particular power projects that have been proposed. In 2012, for example, she prepared a power development plan for Thailand that demonstrated how Thailand could phase out coal, incorporate more renewable energy, and also emphasized energy efficiency and demand side management. And this led to significant public debate on Thailand's own power development plan. So I'm very glad that Chom is able to join us today for Asia. And we'll be talking about enabling a just and sustainable electricity transformation in Thailand. So once again, a warm welcome, Chom, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Maybe let's begin. I think for many of us, electricity planning seems a very technical process. And I wonder if you could just give us an overview of Thailand's electricity sector at present in terms of the generation and who owns it. And maybe from the government's perspective, what's the goal of this energy planning and how do you evaluate this goal?
Yes. So just in terms of the big picture of the power sector in Thailand, in the past, Thailand was basically run by the power sector was run by 3 utilities, EGAT, MEA, and PEA. EGAT is the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, in charge of generation and transmission, and MEA and PEA are distribution utilities in charge of Bangkok metropolitan area, and PEA in charge of the rest of the country. And these 3 utilities were the ones basically in charge of everything, all aspects of electricity provision in Thailand. But since then, since early 1990s, the sector has evolved to include private sector players as well. So now EGAT is no longer the only player in the generation sector. The transmission and distribution are still pretty much, in charge under the responsibility of EGAT and MEA and PEA. But for generation, now we have private sector in charge of provision of generation for basically 2/3 of electricity in Thailand. So EGAT is now, its market share is only 32%, a little less than 1/3. IPP, independent power producers, are larger power plants done by private sector. They represent about 30% of market share. And then smaller scale power plants called small power producers, or SPPs, they have about 19% of market share, and the rest are 11% is imports from neighboring countries, and the rest, the remaining 8% is through very small power producers, mostly renewable energy. So that makes up the, in terms of the breakdown of the players in Thailand. And in terms of energy mix, so that's another way of slicing the pie of the power sector generation. So the predominant source of fuel is natural gas. Natural gas represents about 55% of all the generation in Thailand. Next is coal, particularly lignite. So coal and lignite represent about 17%. The next one is import from neighboring country. That's about 13%. And renewable is around 12% now. So it has been growing. This particular slice has been growing over time. And what's really interesting right now is that, the breakdown that I have provided you is within the power grid of the national grid that's managed by the 3 utilities. But more and more of the consumption is actually offset by self-generation or direct sale from, for example, from VSPP or SPPs directly to their own load or nearby industrial load. And so the portion that is not part of the 3 utilities grid is growing over time as well. And this particular part is around almost 10% now. And the fastest growth is with the solar self-generation or independent power service or IPS. So more and more people are trying to offset consumption from the grid by producing their own electricity, particularly utilizing solar production. So that's the big picture that we have so far. And right now, just in terms of looking at, so I've talked about the generation side. It would be good to also look at who actually consumes the electricity that has been generated. In terms of geographic distribution, 70% of consumption is actually concentrated in central Thailand. Only, so the northern region, northeastern region, and the southern region only consume 10%, around roughly 10% of the country's load. And for the central region, if you drill down even further, you will see that much of the demand is actually from Bangkok area. So Bangkok and metropolitan area represents about 30%, almost 30% of the country's consumption. So in terms of geographical distribution, it's pretty centralized. And another way of slicing the consumption pie too is to look at what kind of consumers are using the electricity. You'll see that the largest group of consumers are industrial customers. They represent about 43% of consumption, and then commercial consumers like businesses represent about 11%. Residential users commercial represent about 22%, and residential is 30%. And there are other miscellaneous users like government and so on. But as you can see, for Thailand, the industrial is still the main group of users for electricity. So in terms of, you had asked a question about the government's goal in planning the power sector. I would say that the primary goal of electricity planning is energy security and resource adequacy. Electricity in Thailand is viewed as a fundamental engine of economic growth, and also is also a driver for stock market growth as well, particularly in recent years. And so other goals, for example, the government also has stated goals of looking at affordability and also taking into account environmental, social, and health impacts. But I would say that these goals are not as high a priority compared to energy security. Energy security seems to be the #1 goal. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. Actually, so this leads on to a second question, which I guess partly relates to energy security, and it definitely relates to planning. So it seems for quite a while now, there's been a discussion about a surplus of electricity in Thailand. I think the technical term is the reserve margin, and that sometimes the reserve margin has been as high as 45%. And at the present time, this has been discussed, I guess, in the context of COVID, but I know that from your own work, this has been a fairly consistent characteristic of electricity planning over the years. So I wonder if you could explain a little bit about why this issue is significant and how did it become so? Why is there a high reserve margin in Thailand, and what should be done about it?
So in the case of electricity sector, demand and supply have to be in balance in order to be able to maintain voltage. And it's really important to maintain the voltage so that you don't have the problem of electronics getting blown up. And with electricity, because when you switch on let's say a microwave, then that would increase the demand, and so demand keeps moving up and down depending on that particular moment, how many factories are running, what kind of appliances people switch on. And so power plants need to be able to follow the load, and as a result some reserve is required in order to make sure that at the peak, when demand goes up, power plants can ramp up production to match the demand. However, because the power grid is all connected, therefore, if one plant were to go out, were to malfunction, we need to make sure that there's enough reserve in the system that can then, take on the extra load to be able to, keep the demand and supply in balance. And that's why it's necessary to have some reserve. And it's been analyzed that 15% reserve over the maximum annual peak is sufficient to maintain a level of reliability that is required for our economy. However, actually the current number in terms of the reserve margin right now is not 15%. It's actually way higher than that. It's right now around 53%. So the excess reserve is good from the perspective of energy security, but not so good in terms of burden on consumer, because all the excess capacity means power plants are built and have to be paid for, but they are not being utilized fully. However, this is a monopoly business, at least in Thailand. Therefore, cost of investment can still be passed on to consumers, even though they are not, they may be underutilized. And so it is a problem, from the overall perspective in terms of the economy, efficiency, and burden on consumers. Therefore, this raises the question of, well, why is this a recent problem because of COVID, or has it been how long has this been a problem? So if you were to look at just the past decade, we'll see that the demand, the reserve used to be at around 20% level 10 years ago. And since then, it has gone up steadily to where we are now, which is 53%. So the problem has gotten worse. So even at 25%, 20 or 20%, that's still higher than the level that's required for efficient operation of the power system. So the the worsening situation of overinvestment over time is due to lack of feedback, and I would say basically lack of accountability. In the past, demand forecast used to be the main driver for how much, for determining how many power plants will get built. And if you look at past statistics, we'll notice that, for every demand, every set of demand projections, the projections are always higher than the actual demand, particularly, as time goes on. But unfortunately, there's no real mechanism for holding the planners accountable. So the mistake is not corrected. And in fact, the mistake is driven by the way the power system is regulated. So for utilities, their profits are tied to the amount of money invested in building power plants. So the more they invest, the more profits they can make. This is because of the rate of return regulation, saying that basically in the case of Thailand, we still use return on invested capital, but because the return is fixed, and the more you invest, the more profit you get. And that's just, simple math that governs the way utilities invest. Also, within this system, the energy corporations that are part of the private sector also benefit from this system. The more contracts that can be signed, the more they are able to have pretty stable return on their investment. Again, this is a single buyer model where you only have one buyer. It's a monopoly business, and therefore a lot of costs can be passed on to consumers. So because over projection of demand leads to overinvestment, and the overinvestment leads to tariffs that can be passed on to consumer, there is no real feedback that would keep the planning process in check to make sure that consumers actually benefit from the outcome of the planning. And therefore this kind of flawed process leads to burden on consumers, but at the same time, it also generates a lot of benefits for utilities and companies that can derive benefits from long-term power purchase contracts. And so you need to make sure that this cycle has to be broken up so that consumers can demand better planning and less burden in the long run. In order to make sure that, and I feel that, in order to break up the cycle, we need to also introduce competition. The monopoly aspect of the sector should be reformed in order to lead to more competition and accountability.
Thanks very much. That's so it's very clear that where the decision making currently lies. I was wondering why is there not that accountability at present? If there's such an overinvestment, is there a way that the electricity consumers, and presumably also because too many state power stations are now being built, that those that are affected by them might also want to have a say about the power planning? Is that possible at present?
I think it would be more possible if there's more participation or more transparency in the decision-making process. Currently, let's say just in general, the difference between the electricity sector and say, maybe cement industry. If a company were to built too many cement factories, and there isn't enough demand to actually purchase cement products from these factories, then that company that has overinvested may not be able to recover its investment, right? Because other companies that invest more efficiently will probably have lower costs and therefore are able to compete better. So the competition and the demand supply, law of demand supply kind of dictates that you don't want to overinvest. But in the case of power sector, planning is done by Ministry of Energy with involvement from stakeholders, particularly the utilities, and the implementation is done by the EGAT and companies that are involved in bidding for IPP contracts or SEP contracts. However, the tariffs are set by energy regulator, ERC, Energy Regulatory Commission, and consumers, who are the stakeholders, don't really have a direct role in the way decisions are made. They only basically pay whatever the regulator says that so pay whatever price set by the regulator. And because the utilities and energy corporations benefit from overinvestment, and unfortunately, there's also some conflict of interest, some overlap between decision makers who make plans, power sector plans, and these companies, in that a lot of the people who are in the power of position to make policies sometimes can also sit on the board of some energy corporations or on the board of directors of the utilities. So you can see that there's some inherent conflict of interest where if the power sector plan, in Thailand, is called Power Development Plan, or PDP. So if the PDP calls for more investment opportunities, there's more profit to be made, and the people who sit on the company boards will also get bonus from these companies doing well. And so you can see that there's a disconnect between decisions that get made on consumers' behalf, but the consumers have very little say in the way the decisions are made, and that's why this lack of accountability or feedback leads to repeated mistakes and overinvestment that has gotten more and more severe.
Great, thanks very much. That's really clear. Maybe on a slightly more optimistic note, you mentioned when you gave an overview of Thailand's electricity sector that there's a growing proportion of renewable energy within the energy mix. And I guess especially in the context of the at least now very high priority that should be given to climate change, this would seem to be a good thing. I wonder if you could share your thoughts a little on how do you see that progress to date? Like, is it moving fast enough? Is there a lot more potential that more of the electricity mix could be renewable? How would you see it?
Yeah, Thailand has made significant progress in trying to promote renewable energy as part of the electricity mix. We had great success in the past 2 decades, I would say, growing steadily. However, recently, we have stalled. The progress has been slowed down, even though, despite the fact that cost of renewable has come down significantly, particularly for solar energy. So now currently, if you just look around the region, among ASEAN, we'll see that, Vietnam has made so much more investment in solar per year than Thailand. Despite, the potential, the investment in the growth in solar is in Thailand is much less, even though despite the price trend. And this is partly because of the excess capacity situation. The government has overinvested, particularly in the area of coal and gas generation, particularly gas generation, as well as imports from hydro projects in Laos. And so, so because of failures or or inefficiency in the planning process in conventional energy, that has really put a brake on further purchase from renewable energy. Another factor too is the fact that renewable energy has grown to a point where the utilities feel threatened. In the case of EGAT used to control 100% market share. Its share has shrank over time, and now renewable energy is the fast growing sector. It has grown to a point where it's viewed as a threat, and so it's a lot of regulations are still not very supportive of further investment in renewables. Just to give you an example, for example, even though right now renewable cost has come down significantly, and this is evidenced by the fact that some people, a lot of industrial customers now have chosen to avoid buying electricity from the grid. They would rather invest in solar panels on their own in order to offset consumption from the grid, because it's cheap enough. Solar is cheap enough for these companies to do that. And as you can see that this particular section of electricity has grown quite a bit. You see 2-digit growth, like 18% growth over the years, every year. So solar is clearly price competitive compared to conventional sources of energy, but they run up against, companies would have loved to invest more, but they run up against some regulations. For example, if you can offset your own consumption, but you can't export excess to the grid. The utilities are putting a cap on that right now, or they come up with conditions that are just not favorable. For example, if you don't want us only to consume within the factory, if you want to say sell to nearby neighboring factories, you have to pay a very expensive charge to use the distribution line in order to deliver the electricity to, just across the wall through the electricity through the distribution line to another factory, and as a result, the regulatory environment is not so supportive of further investment in renewables, despite the fact that if everything were to be open and fair, if the terms for investing in renewable energy were to be fair, you would see a lot more growth in renewables. Looking at international trends, though, with the urgency of climate change, with the concerns about carbon tax, for example, carbon border adjustment mechanism that European Union is adopting, there is a lot of pressure or a lot of momentum towards growing renewable energy piece of the pie in the power mix a lot further. In fact, we need to really think about the cost of not taking action, not decarbonizing our electricity supply, because climate change is definitely a threat. As IPCC, the latest IPCC report has made very clear. So we really need to rethink how we are going to plan for the future of our power sector in order to make sure that we adequately respond to the climate change crisis.
But it seems that it's the wrong way around in a sense, that renewable energy is seen as a threat rather than climate change.
Right.
If so, sometimes in the newspapers when we read about renewable energies, it's sometimes labeled like disruptive technology. And you mentioned earlier, you mentioned about these difficulties of one producer of electricity, if it's off the grid, selling to another, even if they're very close by, if it has to go via the state-owned power lines. So I know that there have been these new technologies like decentralized blockchain systems that are starting to attract a lot of attention, I think in Thailand, but in many other places as well. I wonder if you have any thoughts on these new technologies. Do they hold the potential to transform the energy system? Or do they introduce new forms of accountability questions, for example?
Yeah, yeah, the blockchain technology is really interesting. In fact, Thailand has also embarked on, has done a pilot, small scale pilot project. There's a neighborhood in Sukhumvit 77 maybe, where a housing development used blockchain technology to exchange power, solar power between different households. So some houses, decided to invest in rooftop solar, and if they have surplus electricity, the electricity can be then sold to other neighbors who may have a deficit of solar production. And so they use blockchain technology to figure out, the billings and settlement among the different households. And the project was done with the blessing of MEA, the distribution utility in Bangkok. And it was a success, clearly, it could be done, the technology is there. However, it was like a one-time kind of deal. After that, there might be more that I don't know about, but the regulations are hasn't been done yet, hasn't been adopted to allow that kind of exchange of surplus renewable energy between consumers or prosumers, in this case, producer and consumers combined. But right now, the government actually, the Energy Regulatory Commission has just announced a new code that may perhaps accommodate third-party access. So right now, what needs to happen is, clear rules to allow people to be able to exchange electricity through the MEA or PEA's existing distribution lines. And they have to pay some service fee for using MEA and PEA lines. But the price needs to be fair in order to make it possible and economic, right, for people to be able to do that. And if MEA and PEA don't want to be the one doing billing and settlement between consumers or prosumers, then there can be third-party provider of technology like blockchain technology that can come in and help figure out that part, the accounting, the money accounting. But still, you need MEA and PEA to allow electricity to be sent through the wires, the existing distribution infrastructure that we already have. And I think we are working toward that, but it has not happened yet. And right now, there's still, we are still waiting to see the details of, what's the wheeling charges. Is that going to be fair or economic, or are there any other technical requirements that would be cost prohibitive? So, it remains to be seen. But right now, the main barrier is regulation.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, a prosumer would essentially be a new actor within the energy landscape in Thailand if this was to be taken up at scale. So far, we've really focused on the producing side, like the assumption that more electricity would be required and how to generate that. But I guess there's a more silent side of the equation that you kind of mentioned at the beginning, supply and demand, and that maybe something that doesn't get discussed enough, or at least from what I can see, is that there may be more potential for energy efficiency and similar approaches like demand side management. So essentially to reduce the demand before it is created. I wonder if you had anything that you wanted to comment on that in Thailand, like to what extent is there potential, to what extent is energy efficiency and demand side management already an agenda? And is there the potential to really elevate it as a way of reducing the need for power in the first place?
Yeah, I think energy efficiency and demand side management have a lot of have a big role to play if it's done well. There was an academic study that estimated the potential for energy savings from just investing in efficient technologies, and it found that Thailand has the potential to basically, have to be able to enjoy the same level of energy services, but using a lot, but we could reduce the demand for electricity by 29%. So basically, we could meet some of the demand through investment in efficiency, and that portion is 29% of total load. So this is quite comparable to what has been done in other countries. If you were to look at decarbonization plans of many different countries, number one source of decarbonizing the power sector without investing a lot is basically energy efficiency. And in other countries, energy efficiency represents about 30% of the pie. If we were to reduce carbon dioxide emission, energy efficiency will represent 30% of the impacts in terms of like trying to reduce the carbon footprint of power sector. So in the case of Thailand, we also have lots of potential since Thailand has not invested as much in energy efficiency over the years. So I would say that the potential may be even higher if we really focus on really improving efficiency. However, in the past, despite the approval of energy efficiency plan, the plan has not been well implemented, and so it's been treated as a side project done by a combination of different agencies, but not systematically. For example, EGAT has the program to offer rebates for people who want to buy higher efficiency air conditioners, but still, offering discounts to people who want to buy AC may not be the only way, but it seems like they focus mostly on that. In other countries, you'll see that, people actually get incentivized to put in insulation or to actually design their homes in a way that would actually reduce overall energy requirement of the household. So energy code, building code, could be a big part of improving energy efficiency. Or in the case of in the case of the US, where I live, utilities also give away free energy or water saving shower heads, because water, you use less hot water. That means you use a lot less energy too. So here everything has been explored. All the different ways that we could save energy. Utilities have really put money behind it, to make it happen. In Thailand, we have done some energy efficiency, but it's very not very systematic yet. And we could do a lot more in order to really utilize the full potential of around 30% of our demand.
Great. So I guess one impression I get from our discussion is the issue of regulations is absolutely key to thinking how the electricity sector works in Thailand, and I guess in everywhere else as well. So then the question also becomes, how does policy and how do regulations change, which potentially is a massively expansive question. But I had a specific question on this. A little bit earlier, you mentioned about the EU's new carbon border tax. And I know for many countries whose economies export to Europe in East Asia, this policy is potentially very significant. So as you've already outlined, for Thailand, fossil fuels are essentially still the dominant form of fuel for electricity generation. And in turn, a large proportion of that electricity generation goes to industry. And I would therefore assume that a lot of that ultimately is export industry as well. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether this EU carbon border tax is actually having an impact on Thailand at present in terms of the thinking on electricity planning. And if it is, what type of impact? If it's not, why not? And what type of impact should it have? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it has already motivated some private sector to really think about how to stay competitive once the EU's carbon tax, what do you call, carbon border tax mechanism has, is going to kick in a year or two. So, for example, the Renewable Energy Group within the Federation of Thai Industry has actually recently thought about coming up with an alternative power sector plan, in order to decarbonize the electricity sector, so that their electricity is an important input in the industrial processes. And so if they don't clean up their energy mix, then they will have to pay a heavy penalty in the form of carbon tax, particularly for for companies that export to European markets. And so there has been efforts to look into that, whether or not policy, if the energy plan could change in Thailand. There's also just news today, or was it yesterday, that Federation of Thai Industry also just entered into collaboration with a company, Denso, which is a car manufacturing company. The company has set a target to be carbon free by 2035. And so they are looking into procuring clean electricity in order to displace all their fossil-based energy sources. And so this is an example of how the carbon tax is influencing the private sector right now. And I hope that the private sector is not going to, I hope the industrial sector is not the only one that will switch to clean electricity. I hope that we all also consider that as well, because it's not just about export to the European market, but also just the consequences of not taking action, right? Climate change is already creating impacts, be it drought, extreme weather events, pandemic, and so on. So, as a country, we really need to rethink about, not only the cost of switching to renewables, but also the cost of no action. And I feel this is an area that not a lot of people have looked into yet. And so, yeah, we need to really think more holistically about how we will handle climate change in the future.
I think this leads to the final question. With this Political Ecology in Asia series, we're also asking what type of role can research play towards sustainable and just outcomes. And given the wide-ranging benefits, but also consequences of electricity planning and the way that it materializes, this is, I think, a really important question. And you are the right person to ask this to because of your own work producing research that really has influenced policy in Thailand. So I wonder if you could share a few thoughts on what do you think should be a research agenda to support a just and sustainable electricity transformation in Thailand? And who do you think should do that?
Okay, on the first question on what research should be done, you know, as I mentioned, I think we need to understand more about the cost of no action. You know, if we don't take appropriate action that would sufficiently address the extent of, you know, climate crisis that we are faced with, then we'll pay the price, maybe not in monetary terms, but in terms of damages, in terms of lives lost and so on. So I feel like that's one area that we have not really, we don't have a lot of information to help inform policy makers. And I also feel that, you know, in the case of Thailand, the barrier to energy transformation lies in the structure of the power system, the structure of the governance, the structure of the institution, and, you know, the way the electricity sector is governed and implemented. So I feel it would be really good to look at the you know, how we could introduce more accountability into the power sector decision making. How do we introduce reforms so that we can have more competition and the regulation will be more open and welcoming to consumers, you know, taking part in producing electricity and shaping decisions that are made in the power sector. I feel those are the two main areas that I would love to see more research done. And as to the questions about who should do
it, yeah, is it an academic question or is it others?
I'm not sure, but I would think that everyone, not everyone, but I would love to see academic institutions taking a lead on that. And as for the issues of governance, I would love to see more decentralized form of governance. You know, we don't need central decision makers to make decisions for the whole country. Electricity right now is being decentralized. You know, consumers are now are able to make their own electricity. So it would be great if there's so much more decentralized participation in the way electricity is produced and the way decisions are made and policies are, you know, produced. So if there is a way to also decentralize research too, by allowing grassroots communities or I don't know, different municipalities or provinces that may have the readiness or capacity to take on some of the structural reform, or, you know, taking on planning, local planning, that would be great.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, I've also seen both through the work of Palang Thai and other civil society networks that type of work happens and has impact. So scaling that up is certainly something that seems realistic and valuable to do. I think that's all we have time for today. thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. And I hope that you'll be able to join us again in maybe a few years, and we can talk again optimistically about how things have changed along the lines that you've outlined today. So thank you again for spending time with us, and hopefully see you here again in the near future.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to